Good morning and welcome to the AWS Education Research Seminar Series. I'm Marcy Collinson, your session correspondent and the Scientific Research Programs Manager for the AWS Research Team. Today we are delighted to have Dr. Robert Grossman presenting on the road from data commons to data ecosystems, challenges, opportunities, and emerging best practices. Dr. Grossman, or Bob as he likes to go by, is the Frederick H. Rawson Distinguished Service Professor in Medicine and Computer Science and the Jim and Karen Frank Director of the Center for Translational Data Science at the University of Chicago. He has also served as the Chief Research Informatics Officer of the Biological Sciences Division since 2011. He is the Principal Investigator for the National Cancer Institute Genomic Data Commons, or the GDC, a platform for the cancer research community that manages, analyzes, integrates, and shares large-scale genomic data sets in support of precision medicine. He has also built data commons to support research in other areas, including cardiology, neuroscience, infectious disease, and the environment. He serves as chair of the Open Commons Consortium, a nonprofit that develops and operates data commons to support research in science, medicine, healthcare, and the environment, and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Association of Computing Machinery. We will reserve the last 5 to 10 minutes of the session for a Q&A portion, but please feel free to place any questions that you may have during the presentation in the questions queue in the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we will read them aloud later on. So without further ado, I'll pass the microphone over to Bob. Bob, please take it away.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the questions at the end of this presentation. I want to just say a sentence or two about our center. I think everyone knows that data science is the intersection of math, statistics, computer science, and engineering to a scientific, business, or societal problem. Our center focuses on what is beginning to be called translational data science. Translation has been used for a long time to describe the process of taking a basic discovery in medicine and healthcare and bringing it to impact the healthcare community. And translational data science is when you use data science to attack a broad problem of interest, of human or societal interest. And we focus in translational data science at our center. I'm going to give an introduction to data commons. I think everyone on the phone is more aware than I am of the growth of data in the biomedical community. And although my talk, although the technology I'm going to describe today is broadly applicable, I'm going to focus today on its applications to biology, medicine, and healthcare. So we have all sorts of data from next-gen sequencing to wearable data. It's common to think of data as the new oil and AI as the new factory, but we also have a lot of challenges. We have the infrastructure challenges as data grows. We have the specialized computing infrastructure required by AI. When you're analyzing biomedical data, often it's generated by different groups and processed by different algorithms, and that creates very serious batch effects. And when we work with data derived from human subjects, even if it doesn't have human identifiers and is not human subject data from a compliance viewpoint, we always try to protect that data with as strong security and compliance as we can, while making the data analyzable and accessible and shareable to people authorized to work with it. Often what's not said is that there's just because we have more data and just because we have more opportunities, and even though we have more challenges, more or less the level of funding to build platforms in biomedical data science is fixed. And so these three forces created the opportunity to build what is now called a data commons. And my definition of data commons is when you use cloud computing to co-locate data with all the software tools and services and applications and notebooks and workspaces so that you have a resource for the community for managing, sharing, analyzing, and doing collaborative analysis over data. And these are data commons really, as I'll describe in my talk, represent a significant advance in the platforms we have to analyze and make discoveries from biomedical data. This has been an active space for the last decade. We've built several of these platforms. Other platforms have been built by other institutions, including Broad and the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, by companies such as DNA Nexus. And this is a very active area. I'm going to focus on sort of the general principles today and illustrate them with some of the systems that we've built, but this is an active area, and it's a good area to get involved in. So as cloud computing and the large scale cloud computing that Amazon provides and all their services, there was an important transition in how we worked with biomedical data. And this was driven by genomics, where one of the first projects in the biomedical space I worked on was the Cancer Genome Atlas. This was a petabyte of data, but this was a petabyte of data in 2010, where there were no standard ways to work with a petabyte of data. The S3 services and other services for data storage were still pretty new to this community. There was no way to sort of consistently work with data objects in clouds from a computational viewpoint. And some of you can think of this first generation and that was developed in the 2010 to 2015. And I think we're going to be using these for at least the next decade. For simplicity, I just think of these as data clouds. It's a data lake model in which you have data objects in clouds. They are hopefully identified with persistent identifiers, and we'll come back to that. They have metadata. You can analyze them with container-based workflows. There's security and compliance around it. There's sort of oftentimes these are custom built for particular projects, so they tend not to be able to interoperate, but they represent a major advance in the ability to analyze petabyte scale genomic data sets, large scale imaging. You can easily do image analysis, deep learning of images and of genomic data over this kind of platform. Where we are, several years ago, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, GA4GH, started to look at standards. And the reason this was possible is there were a number of large-scale cloud computing projects, including distributed one. A recent article a couple months ago in Nature talked about the PCOG analysis, the Pan-Cancer Analysis Working Group, which analyzed data from both the Cancer Genome Atlas and the International Cancer Genomic Consortium, ICGC. That was only 2,000 or so subjects, but it was whole genome data. It was a couple petabytes of data. It was done in 4 locations. It was the first large-scale distributed cloud computing in cancer that was done. We learned a lot, and those kind of lessons went into some of the activities in GA4GH. It's interesting, although we have a pretty standard interface now for data objects in clouds, and I'll come back to it, it's a GA4GH DRS standard, that's still not using persistent identifiers. There's no standards for metadata. Data is still pulled into a computing environment, and there's been a much slower than I would have expected consensus on workflow languages and workflow execution systems. But this was a major advance. I think based on the early work with data clouds, we started a project in 2014 that was launched in 2016 called the NCI Genomic Data Commons. This was arguably the first data commons that was built. The GDC exposes an API and has a data model. And that creates an open system. So not only do we use that API and that data model to build our apps, but we eat our own dog food in the sense that we don't do anything that is not exposed through that app. Through that API. That API allows access to both controlled and open access data. It supports authorization and authentication through NIH systems so that authorized users get access to controlled access data such as germline variants that they have to sign certain data use agreements to access. The NCI Genomic Data Commons is a widely used system. It has right now over 83,000 cases, several petabytes of data, over 63 projects, over 22,000 genes, over 3 million mutations. It's an interactive system. Each month, over 20,000 users use it. Each year, over 160,000 unique users use it. Each month, between 1.5 and 2.5 petabytes of data is accessed from it in cloud-based analysis or for downloading. And each month we do over 25 container-based bioinformatics pipelines are executed in an automated system for harmonizing the data that's submitted. It's based on an open source stack, so you can build your own commons. It consists of multiple portals, a data exploration portal for genomic data, for clinical data, a data submission portal, GPAS, the GDC pipeline automation system that runs those 25 to sometimes as many as 50,000 container-based pipelines each month. It is arguably one of the largest systems out there for analyzing with a common data model, common bioinformatics pipelines, cancer. It's a system for the NCI, and if you generate cancer genomics data and are funded by the NCI, your data will probably end up here. I want to talk a little bit about data commons. Again, the first one was available in beta in 2015, launched in 2016. I think this technology is going to be around for a couple decades. It's based on the data lake model of data objects such as BAM files, the molecular data, CRAM files, image data, other large objects, storing them in clouds. It supports workspaces in clouds. One of the things that distinguishes the data commons from a data cloud is the use of a data model for biospecimen, clinical, phenotype, and other structured data. The API supports that data model, so you can build custom virtual cohorts and do custom analysis in our Studio and Jupyter notebooks and custom workspaces. Data commons come with a governance model, a data sharing model, support reproducible research. From an architecture viewpoint, it's based on a model. Our data commons are based on graph models, and they support structured data as well as the data objects. And this is one of the current challenges in platforms for large-scale biomedical data is, the molecular data, although very, very large at the petabyte, multiple petabyte scale, is relatively simple to manage as a data object in a cloud with a persistent identifier, a long-lived identifier with metadata attached to it. But the phenotype data, the clinical data, the biospecimen data, all the other structured data might be a gigabyte or tens of gigabytes, maybe occasionally a terabyte, but there is no consensus on how to manage this data in a cloud-based platform and how to interoperate with other clouds using this. And we'll come back to that. There's data commons as data lakes, use container-based workflows to harmonize data. The difference between a data, one of the important aspects of a data commons is when data comes in, it is usually and preferentially the basic raw data so that the pipelines can be applied to it that are common to all the data that is submitted to the commons. This process of curating, harmonizing, and using a common set of bioinformatics pipelines that produce, not only make it reproducible, but get rid of the complex analysis and some of the steps that take place when different groups analyze different sets of biomedical data with slightly different pipelines and standards, which creates differences that are sometimes hard to deal with. These also have open APIs. I just want to step back for a minute. I actually think that it's not generally understood how big a change data commons are from the viewpoint of how we manage scientific data. I think people think of data commons as just using cloud-based services, but it's a significant paradigm shift. I mean, at 50,000 feet, we've used databases to organize data around a project. We have a very good discipline of how to build data warehouses to organize data for an organization. But data commons take the first step to trying to organize data for a scientific discipline or field. That involves not only scale and complexity issues, but standards issues, interoperability issues, and all sorts of other issues. And that's why I think these are a really significant step forward. I just want to briefly talk about an essential tension in biomedical research. The data belongs to the patients, and most data comes to us from research studies in which patients pass consent to us. The benefit they expect and the benefit we owe them is to make advances in healthcare that will benefit them directly or indirectly. There's a trend to allow what's called patient-partnered research, so that participants can directly submit data. But we always have this balance of how do we protect the data that's submitted to us, yet make it easy to use to get discoveries that benefit patients. And data commons are focused a lot on giving knobs for those set of trade-offs. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a project called Gen 3. We've been building data commons and data clouds for over a decade. We've built 3 generations of them. The GDC that I talked about, which is used by over 160,000 researchers each year, was essentially our 2nd generation. It was a lot of effort to build that, and so we started a project whose internal name was Gen 3, and despite my strenuous objections, it is now its external name, and it is a way, as I'll describe in the next slide, it's an open source platform so that you could build your own data commons relatively simply. And if you go to gen3.org, you can see it. We're right now starting really trying to build the community. It's used by third parties without our help to build Gen 3 data commons for pharmaceutical company will be, I think there's been some press releases about that. We'll be doing some training and other webinars around that to make it easier for people to use this. There are basically 3 steps to build a Gen 3 data commons. You first define a data model using the Gen 3 platform. It's a graph-based data model. Once you have that data model, the Gen 3 platform will auto-generate the data commons and associated APIs. It will generate a data submission portal, a data exploration portal, the API. It will bring up the required security and compliance. You can then import data using the data submission portal or the data submission API. You can then explore data and you could use one of the provided workspaces, Jupyter Notebooks, RStudio, and others, or build your own. And all the data submission portal, the data exploration portal, the RStudio, the Jupyter Notebooks, the custom apps, all use that same API. We've been lucky to have a wonderful group of partners, and we've built now over a dozen Gen 3 data commons, from liquid biopsies to neurology to birth defects to cancer to sequencing to canine data models. Canine model organisms, to allergies and infectious diseases for the VA, for heart, lung, blood, and sleep, and for environmental data. As well as partners, as well as third parties have built these for private ones, and we have several of these private ones out there now, including ones for a pharmaceutical company. I want to talk about the next step. The data commons is a very, very, I think, significant step forward. The GDC is the largest. There are quite a few others out there. I showed you our Gen 3 data commons. There are other groups are building these. But I want to look now in the next part of this talk to where these platforms are going to over the next 5 years. And these are what you might call data ecosystems. And there's been a fair amount of work from the cloud computing perspective on how do you build a data commons, and how do you build ones for large organizations, and how can they interoperate. There was a number of different points of view. One point of view was, just to let a given organization bring one up, and they would figure it out. And that's how most of these early ones were built. Another point of view was to work out sort of a long list of requirements and require everyone to build commons with those requirements, and then they would interoperate. We were in the minority, and we took a different point of view. We took the point of view of what is sometimes called the end-to-end design principle in software. This was argued famously by a paper about the internet by Salter, Reed, and Clark from quite a while ago, and it from 1984, and it argued that you should agree on a small number of services that would form the core, the so-called end-to-end of the system, and then the inputs to the inputs on the web, it would be the producers of websites and content producers, etc. And on the other end would be the apps that consume it, the browsers and the games, etc. And they, if it's a property of the internet, that just to remind everyone that didn't have to be there. If I bring a new type of media, like streaming media and like videos, I have to have new servers for the videos, and I have to have new extensions to the browsers, but no one expects you to update the wires and the routers and the other internal lower layers of the stack. And so that's not usually the case, and that certainly wasn't the case of data commons. So we created an end-to-end design principle, which we call narrow middle, for building data commons and their and other architectures like data ecosystems, which I'll describe. And here, rather than saying these are all the services you have to do, we're saying you only have to support a small number of services, APIs for authentication, authorization, digital IDs, data object, metadata, and as you'll hear me talk about, some services for clinical data and phenotype data. We call these the framework services. And then we built commons like this, and we built these before Jupyter Notebooks came, where they're around but not widely used. I think one of the tests of this architecture was we immediately supported Jupyter Notebooks and RStudio and other API-based apps without changing any of the framework services. And so in the same way you can add new modalities of data to the internet without changing the routers and switches, the framework services are designed to support a wide variety of ways of curating, harmonizing, organizing, integrating data, and a wide variety of ways from portals to workspaces to simulations to make discoveries over cloud-based storage and cloud-based services. And that's how we build our systems. And this is an example of this view. You know, on the left is, I'm not a very good artist, but I think you could recognize on the left is a data science who's curating and submitting data. The data science is not very happy because people don't realize how important her work is when they curate data. On the right is a happy data scientist making a discovery. And in the middle are the framework services. And then the cloud services are over them. And, you know, we have a lot of cloud agnostic services. So a simple data ecosystem is built when a data commons exposes an API that can support a collection of applications. And more complex ecosystems are built when you take framework services and a narrow middle architecture to support a variety of different applications, data resources, workspaces, knowledge bases, etc. And I'm very proud of our Gen 3 data ecosystem. We built all those data commons, over a dozen of them, with a common set of framework services. If someone is authorized to access data in 2 or more of them, then applications can be built that transparently access data from them. And in this way, we build an ecosystem with several dozen petabytes of data behind it, with 8.6 petabytes of data publicly accessible to users, over 45 million files, with over 600,000 participants and subjects across all these commons, that, you know, shortly will, I think within 6 to 12 months, be over 1 million different subjects. So it's an ecosystem that stretches across different types of diseases, different organizations, but it's an example of a data ecosystem built over this narrow middle architecture. This to me is a very important next stage in how data platforms are going to be built for data ecosystems. I think of a data ecosystem as supporting not a discipline or a community like a data commons, but extending over multiple communities of disciplines. The first one was launched only a couple of years ago for the National Cancer Institute. Today we have them, we have 3 or 4 of these. Data ecosystems interoperate multiple data commons, multiple data bases, multiple knowledge bases, and other resources. You can create an ecosystem of applications, as I've described, and you can support multiple data models. Nothing comes for free. The applications have to be smart enough to work across data models, but a lot of these commons have a similar core model, and I'll describe some technology in a few minutes that makes it easier to do this. So, you know, as usual, the data lake model is there. There are framework services for authentication, authorization, data objects, and their metadata and their persistent IDs. Importantly, which I'll describe in the next section, services for clinical and phenotype data, open APIs, and the governance is even more important. We are looking for partners as we build and federate data ecosystems. And I'd be very, very pleased to hear from anyone who wants to be part of sort of this next stage and how biomedical platforms are being built. There's something I haven't mentioned is governance and best practices for building data commons and data ecosystems. We've been building these for a while with private-public partnerships. So several of us created a not-for-profit called the Open Commons Consortium in 2008 that helps not-for-profits and foundations, government agencies, and companies bring up data commons and data ecosystem, and helps with the governance agreements, the ecosystem agreements, security and compliance, legal templates, and et cetera. So we have gen3.org to bring up a Gen3 Commons, OCC with the governance and SecOps and some of those other things. And we'll be spinning out a portion of Gen3 for the framework services. And we're also working, a group of us are going to be starting to work with GA4GH to create standards around some of the framework services. So I'm going to talk briefly about sort of where we don't have consensus, where we need experimentation, and where a lot of the hard work is. And this is, how do you deal with the clinical phenotype and other data? This is an area that has a lot of work and activity. You know, we have FHIR, we have OMOP, we have other emerging standards. I'm focused very narrowly on how do we bring the services into the framework services for bulk clinical or phenotype data. So these will be built over FHIR and OMOP, et cetera. And I want to describe this in the next few slides. So clinical and phenotype data tends to go through a life cycle like all data. The data model changes from time to time. New data comes in, the platform changes, and if the data is useful, you see multiple schema changes, multiple additions of data, which requires new schema, multiple harmonization, which requires remapping the data, platform changes. And if over 5 or 10 years, and good data lasts that long and much longer from a research interest and a healthcare impact interest, you need a way to manage data over this life cycle. And so there is no simple way to do that now from a platform perspective. And you know, it's very simple to manage the CRAM, BAM image files. They have persistent IDs, and it's easy to point to them, but we don't have a bulk way of working with this clinical and phenotype data. And that's also important to make it reproducible. The services I've described, if you dig into them, are really focused on not only scaling in a cloud environment, but supporting reproducibility in a cloud environment. We don't have that for clinical data. So we're working with a small group and are interested in expanding this to create something called the Portable Format for Biomedical Data, or PFB. It's based on Avro, and it is designed to support the interoperability of bulk clinical or phenotype data or other structured data like biospecimen data. Applications can import and export this. You can update data models with this. You can support versioning. You could support backwards and forwards compatibility. It's based on the Avro binary format. And importantly, it brings together the data model, the data dictionary, and pointers to third-party ontologies and controlled vocabularies. And that allows you to sort of, as a sort of encapsulated Avro object with this metadata, you can version it, you can create it as a fair object, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And importantly, you can easily import and export into standard services. You could bring it up into a Neptune database. You could export it as JSON. We're creating a PFB on FHIR format. We're mapping OMOP to this. These things changed a lot, and we implemented this both with Avro and protocol buffer, but because of the self-contained ability of Avro, that's why we chose it in the end. And so the way we think of it is applications can export it, other applications can import it. It could be managed as an enterprise object over its life cycle, and it could be easily managed. So most in our Gen 3 Commons that are coming out, we use now and will be coming out in beta for others, there's the ability to import and export projects as PFB files. I want to end for just a couple minutes with what are principles to support data sharing, discovery in this space. Without data sharing, we tend not to have enough data to create what's often called a learning healthcare system, especially for certain types of diseases. The data sharing has had a very important role. To remind you, the Bermuda Principles from 1982 guided the immediate or near immediate publication of genetic sequencing data. It's easy to forget that data did not have to be so easily available, could be locked up in proprietary databases, but principles got together that funded those projects and created the Bermuda Principles. It's changed science and created multiple billion-dollar industries. The open science and open access principles for publications with archive servers and open access is in the process of changing how we do things. And I've been interested in the question, what are the principles that might govern data commons and data ecosystems to support open science? So, the Bermuda Principles have the automatic release of genomic data, immediate publication of finished annotated sequence, and a sort of the acknowledgement of the importance of this to biomedical science. I've been advocating for just 3 principles in this space. One is, I'm just trying to read these 3. First, agencies and foundations that fund biomedical research should require researchers to share the data. This sounds obvious. This is sometimes done. It tends to be done by NIH. It's done by policy at NIH, but it's not uniformly done, especially for private foundations, certainly not for a lot of funded research. 2, and this is where, without this, one is not actionable. Unless the agencies and foundations that fund biomedical research fund the computing infrastructure, whether they're commons or ecosystems, there are no platforms to share data and to do open science. So 1 is not actionable without 2. And then once you have 2, you have the ability to have the principles that come out between the agencies and foundations that fund research to interoperate their commons and other resources to create ecosystems that will benefit patients through discoveries that researchers can make. So I've written a bit about this. There are some meetings that discuss this, but I just wanted to sort of end on this. Why do this? It's going to move the field faster. It's going to support repeatable, reproducible, and open research. Biomedical research is not easy. The effects are often multi-genetic. The effects are small. The effects are compounded by lots of compounding and confounding variables. The environmental interactions are complex. And without these kinds of systems, we don't have the statistical power to do good science. And you know, a lot of times we think of the publication as being the end result. I would like to think of these commons as being one of the end results, where, you know, you can have a Bayesian model that just sort of updates whenever you put new data in. And then as we build these commons, we can begin to interoperate them to create data ecosystems and gain network effects. So I want to end with some questions. I'm not allowed to give talks these days without telling you that both the University of Chicago Center for Translational Data Science and the 501c3 not-for-profit, the Open Commons Consortium, are both hiring. And both organizations are looking for volunteers who want to give some of their time to sort of help with build these systems or help make discoveries over these systems and sort of benefit patients in that way. I guess I have time for a few questions now. I should say this deck will
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bob.
References. Thank you. I'm sorry. Back to you, Marcy.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful presentation. One of the questions that popped up in our questions queue was, can we get a link to the slide deck? And yes, this slide deck, along with this recording of this presentation, will be available on the Past Presenters tab on our AWS Education Research Seminar Series webpage. So that should be posted shortly after this presentation. So on to the next, same question. Is the deck available for download? Yes. So you'll have access to that soon via that web page. So I'll jump into some other questions, but if you have questions, the audience, I would encourage you to put them in the questions queue and I'll happily read them aloud so Bob can answer them, but I'll dive into some we already have. Bob, what are the barriers to data sharing today?
I think that I'm going to highlight one technical and then the I would say the governance barriers. I would say we have good architectures to share data objects like BAM, CRAM, image, and other types of files. We don't have good architectures to share and support and manage bulk clinical phenotype data that is so critical to using these systems. And that's partly why, you know, we're trying to build a community around PFB and tooling and resources. So on the technical side, I would say it's even though we have FHIR for certain types of applications, the type of structures and platforms for the research community over FHIR, like PFB over FHIR and things like that, we don't have. On the what I would call the principal side, we have everyone's agreeing to that we should share data, but very few groups actually sharing data. So that's a sort of why I ended with the principles. There have to be carrots and sticks, and presumably they're going to come from the patients who will benefit, the funders of research. But we have a lot of talk and not much action. You know, big hat, no cattle in one expression in terms of data sharing. And then, you know, once we have that, I think it's relatively easily to work out governance principles. But I would say at a high level, those are the barriers.
Great. Next question from the audience. This came from Trang Chen. How do you ensure privacy on human data in data commons?
It's a great question. I alluded to these. So it's that could be a whole talk. About half of these commons operate at FSMA moderate with sort of a complex set of policies, procedures, and controls to protect it. Those that don't operate at FSMA moderate with an authority to operate from a federal official at an institute, they could be operated by a university or by the OCC, the 501c3, or by a foundation. We use the same policies, procedures, and controls. So from a security, compliance, audit, privacy point of view, we put these policies, procedures, and controls into the system. That's a large portion of the work, including all the auditing and other efforts required. What I didn't talk about and what the OCC does, what this means is as data comes in through data contributors agreement, we sort of make sure that the data use agreements that are required for people who use controlled access data match the data contributors agreement, and we can monitor that. And then there's a whole security and compliance process that the Gen 3 Commons and the framework services support, from authorization to authentication to use of things called the data use ontology and other types of technical controls to put the required policies in. Depending upon the sensitivity of the data, we can also sometimes we won't expose the data per se, but we'll support queries over the data of known types so that we know how much information is released and that's been pre-approved. So it's not an easy. There's a lot to be said there, but I've gone over some of the ways we manage that. The Commons from a compliance viewpoint have non-human subject data, what's sometimes called de-identified data, but that doesn't lessen the necessity of having to put these policies, procedures, and controls in place.
Great. Another question from the audience. This is coming from Gang Fu. Any initiative for medical image exchange in DICOM format?
Yeah, the DICOM format is supported by a number of the commons. I think importantly, we try to be silent on when we do this on anything in which there's a well-established format. There's a little bit of complexity on how DICOM maps to data objects. We are supporting the GA4GH DRS bundles that can be used to wrap DICOM objects into bundles, DICOM images into bundles. There's obviously the issues of how you remove identifying information or potentially identifying information from DICOM. I'm not going to address that. The current GA4GH standard supports temporary identifiers, so we support persistent identifiers and bundles with persistent identifiers. That should be enough to work with DICOM objects, and we're supporting those in commons that are coming online over the next few months, and we also have them in existing commons like the Brain Commons.
Great. Next question from the audience is from Haider Fatlawi. I am a PhD student at Eötvös Loránd University in Hungary and working on biomedical data stream mining. I need a medical data online stream for my research. Can I get such kind of a data?
If by stream we mean the kind of streams that come from wearable data, some of the commons have streaming data in there, but you would have to work with each of the commons. Each commons is built by a sponsor and has rules of who could use that data, etc. That data will be coming to the Brain Commons, but it's not available to the public yet. If you mean by streaming data, the type of data that you might get from a hospital monitor or from environmental sensors, we have a little bit of environmental data, but not biomedical data in the environmental data commons that we do jointly with NOAA. I'm not aware of the kind of data you get from streams from hospital sensors and other kinds of monitors that you might get from a healthcare kit or something. But those things are available from other sources.
Great. Next question. Can any of this be applied to COVID-19 research?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, we're putting together a small group to think through that, to bring up a COVID-19 data commons for the research community. So if you're interested in that, please contact me.
Great. What are some of the challenges building these types of platforms?
I talked a little about that. Let me highlight those. I wouldn't say it's a challenge as much as a tax. The tax for being in this space is you're going to spend 25% of your time doing security, compliance, privacy, and related issues. So that's a tax. It makes things quite a bit harder. I think I've highlighted the challenges moving from commons to ecosystems. What are the framework services? How do we build standards around the framework services? How do we build a critical mass around them? And how do we create framework services that satisfy all the requirements we have for clinical and phenotype data? That's the PFB and related efforts. It's not so much a technical challenge as much as I would say a market challenge, in that I've been waiting 20 years for standards for scientific workflows to develop. I'll probably be working another 20 years, and I would like to see standards for workflows that are good enough, if not perfect, so that we don't have to go through so much duplicate effort when working with workflows. It's easy to say we're going to do this in containers, but the hard part is oftentimes sort of working with somehow the execution services for workflows, especially, we have okay but not great ones that are open source, and that would be helpful.
Great. Another question from the audience. This one comes from Ivory Blakely. I develop a pipeline manager for a bioinformatics research group. Where can I find the API to allow our pipeline module to interact with data stored in a Gen 3 data commons?
Just go to gen3.org and you can see the API. And we also, the slides will have a paper we wrote about the GDC API. It's based on GraphQL that was sort of popularized by Facebook, so it should be a very, very familiar API. We expose the data model as a graph model, then use basically RESTful endpoints and subsets of GraphQL.
Great. How long does it take to stand up a Gen 3 data commons?
Great question. We typically, a lot of it is understanding the data and understanding a scientific problem so that you could build a notebook and show that you've done it end to end. We typically do it in 2 to 3 months. That includes understanding the data, ingesting the data, understanding a scientific question, building a notebook. I think it's been done faster by other groups. I know there are third parties who sort of do this and get paid for it, and can do it even faster than that. And I should say there are efforts that I hope come out over the next 6 months where we're going to try to bring Gen 3 as a service up. So you just sort of fill in small, medium, and large, and you'll get a Gen 3 Commons just on Amazon, for example.
Great. Well, I think we've come to the end of our questions portion with the audience, because I don't see any others in the queue, but I want to go ahead and thank you, Bob, so much for your knowledge and wisdom on this matter. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk about it. For the audience, I wanted to let you guys know that our next session will be on April 30th at 9:00 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and our presenter will be Professor Frank Wertfein. He will be discussing GPU cloud bursting for multi-messenger astrophysics with IceCube. So please make sure you check out our AWS Education Research Seminar Series webpage for additional information on that upcoming session, as well as to register for the session. And I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about our Cloud Credits for Research program. So Nader, if you wouldn't mind transitioning screens. And hopefully everybody can see my screen now. So I just wanted to bring to everybody's attention that we do have a program called the Cloud Credits for Research program. And trying to advance, I'm sorry. There we go. Hopefully you guys, I know this little toolbar might be in the way. So the AWS Public Sector Cloud Credits for Research program supports researchers who seek to build cloud-hosted publicly available science as a service applications, softwares, or tools to facilitate their future research and the research of their community. It also helps to perform proof of concept or benchmark testing, evaluating the efficiency of moving research workloads or open data sets to the cloud, and helps to train a broader community on the usage of cloud for research workloads via workshops or tutorials. So want to go ahead and just give you guys a little bit more information. In order to apply, please visit this link. The current cadence is quarterly, and promotional credit terms and conditions can be found at this link. And so with that, thank you all for joining. We really appreciate your support of the series, and we welcome feedback. And if you are interested in being a presenter, please visit the AWS Education Research Seminar Series webpage, where you can find a email domain to email us about your interest. Thank you very much.